Michael Moore is a former Australian politician and health academic, and currently the Chief Executive Officer of the Public Health Association of Australia. We were fortunate to be able to interview him about how politicians view unknowns and what they do with them.
So thanks for coming in to talk to us. One of the interesting things about politics is that unknowns actually have a number of benefits. One of them is delay. Can you tell us a bit about that?
I often talk about delay in politics and people laugh about it in a way, oh, they're just trying to delay. And yes, there's a fair chance they are just trying to delay because it is one of those tools that you use very deliberately if you're actually clever at politics. So the three options really are, in a policy sense, is you want to implement it, yes, go for it. You want to oppose it, then say no. Or you want to oppose it but you know you're going to lose, then can you delay? And invariably delay has a strong impact of giving you the opportunity, if you like, to amass your troops, your evidence, whatever is necessary to turn things around. So the most commonly used element, I think, in politics is delay, and whilst people laugh about it, really should step back from it and say, actually, it's a serious tool.
Now, also, delay can have quite a psychological impact, can't it? I mean, there's a lot of evidence that the longer something is delayed, the less likely people think it's actually going to happen.
And because it becomes less, it can't be too important. If it's been allowed to be delayed all this time, then it suddenly becomes less important. And I think that's another really effective element of creating delay as a political technique.
And just to be clear, the link between delay and unknowns is that often saying that there's an unknown, like we don't know enough about what the community thinks or we need to do some more research, is used as the excuse for the delay. So that's
almost every time.
Yeah.
Almost every time. So why else would you do delay? Well, we don't know something, there's not enough research. We almost always argue there's not enough research. By the way, I don't think I've ever made a decision politically where there was enough research. You could always have more research. Really, in the end, somebody who's effective goes, we know we should know more, so there's an element of uncertainty. But this is what we've got. Now we've got to make the decision with what we've got and move ahead on it. But that element of the unknowns helps so much in those who are trying to use delay.
Now, you've also written about the challenges that unknowns present in politics. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
No, look, I think that by and large the challenge, one of the big challenges for all politicians is to try and work out how to deal with this whole notion of the unknown and uncertain, and to do it in one of two ways. One, to understand it and use it as a technique to achieve your goal, or to do the opposite, to make sure that you really know how to deal with uncertainty. I think people do it automatically, but I think a certain amount of thought and consideration and reflection around it, and in some ways that's the biggest problem for politicians. They actually don't get enough time for serious, sensible reflection.
Are there any circumstances where it's not a weakness to admit that you made a mistake or that you're wrong?
By and large, admitting that you were wrong in politics is not a good manoeuvre. It's not considered to be a good manoeuvre. Interesting enough for me, very early in my days in politics, I had made a quite significant mistake. I had effectively told a lie. It wasn't a lie because I just created an impression something was that it wasn't. So I didn't actually tell a lie, but hell, it wasn't far off it. And I remember going before a doorstop, a considerable doorstop, and saying, no, I made a mistake. I shouldn't have created that impression. And that won't happen again when I was in politics. Now, 4 or 5 of the journalists who were there at that doorstop a year later said to me, first time they'd ever heard it, and they thought that somebody here is different. And I went on to get re-elected a number of times. I think what was happening, though, is it was a one-off. The problem is you get away with it, and actually it's quite a good technique on rare occasions. Yes, I was wrong. This is what I've done to correct it. This is what we need to go. But I think it's something that can only be used rarely, and actually then it can be seen as a strength. But as soon as it's repeated 2 or 3 times, it rapidly becomes a weakness.
So one of the other ways of using unknowns to your benefit is to use vagueness to your benefit, and you've talked in other contexts about not being too specific about outcomes, because that can get you into a lot of trouble, and being vague is actually helpful. Can you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, I actually think if anybody watched Yes Minister at all, you would actually get a good understanding of this concept. When you're really specific about an outcome, then people actually measure that really, really carefully. I think it's important to have specific outcomes in your own mind, so you know what you're going to achieve. But people in politics don't measure what you've achieved. At the next election, they're looking at what you didn't achieve that you said you would. So, as an example, when I became minister, I wrote and with the department introduced a document called Setting the Agenda. It had 12 goals, 12 specific goals that I would meet by the time my first term as minister had ended. When having published it, a week later I went to a ministerial meeting of the health ministers and handed it out and said, here's my thing. And to a person they all said, you're just absolutely mad, because of the 12 things you've got there'll be one that you don't achieve, and that's all that they'll focus on in the next election. And in fact, they were right in this sense, that I did achieve 11 and one of them I did not achieve. As it turned out, I wasn't running for the next election. But it was very clear to me that there was still, even though I wasn't running, there was still a focus on saying, look, they said they'd have a electronic health record, was what it was about for the community, in place, and it's not. What else haven't they achieved? So, whereas had I been a little broader in the way I had described that, then I think I would have been politically less vulnerable.
You referred to Yes Minister. Do you want to just explain what that is? Because not everybody's going to know what it
So
was.
there's a British program called Yes Minister, in which the minister and the public servant sort of tussle over ideas. And one of the most famous lines in there, when the minister says, well, I'm going to do so-and-so, a specific goal, the public servant says, well, Minister, that's very courageous. And of course, when you hear the word courageous as a minister, you think, oh, I don't want to be courageous. I want to get things done, but I don't want to be courageous. Means you're vulnerable to attack by the opposition, and so it's quite a funny television show that exposes the nature of politics, and actually, having listened to and thought about uncertainty, I think it's actually almost worth watching an episode of Yes Minister. The one I like best is when the minister is opening a hospital and very proud of his hospital, and the hospital has no problems whatsoever. It's the best possible hospital in the UK because it has no patients. So of course, well, if you don't have any patients, then you have no problems. And in some ways, that sort of epitomises politics. If you don't have problems, then nobody can criticise you. You just don't achieve anything.
Yeah, one of my favourite lines out of that show is where the public servant actually advises the minister at a particular occasion to tell the public the truth, and the minister is shocked and says,
Yes.
What, the truth, the whole truth? And the public servant says, oh, no, not the whole truth.
Not the whole truth, exactly. And look, I think that is important. You know, in the end, the ministers and the politicians' credibility is really on how they respond in principle to how they're elected, rather than the detail. And it's actually a breach of the principles that is where they run into serious strife, rather than trying to build a new hospital and finding that that didn't happen quickly enough. People understand that.
You've also written about the trade-offs between things like principles and ideals on the one hand, and pragmatics and hard decisions that have to be made in politics as well. Can you say something about that?
Invariably, what happens in politics is that, especially when you're in a position of power, that you have so much money. And so it's very easy to promise everything, but paying for it is another issue. And there becomes a different order of things in politics and a different order of principle even. Was, in my case, it was particularly difficult in a cabinet where I worked with a Liberal government and as an independent minister, and I had a set of principles published really clearly out there, and at times they were in conflict with the rest of the cabinet. Now, the arrangement I had was I could step aside from cabinet on some issues, and I did, and that happened quite regularly. But there was some in which we both made a commitment, but we just didn't have the money to deliver, and so that requires a compromise, or something I was particularly keen on delivering, but I could only deliver 70% of it. And that actually sometimes makes your constituents quite uncomfortable because you compromise too much. Mm. And so the choice is, do you deliver 70% or do you deliver nothing?
So one of the things you have to do as a politician is make decisions without having full information in the face of uncertainty. How do you deal with that?
With difficulty. In the end, you actually have to say, what I am going to do is I am going to make decisions based on the best information I have to me at the given time, when the decision is necessary. Otherwise, delay becomes difficulty, not because you're trying to use delay, but because you become indecisive. And indecisiveness is also a political millstone. It's just not something that the community accepts. So before you make a decision, you still look around, you ask for information, and you know, a minister has a whole department there to help them get information. They have staffers, and I also had quite a run of people who were not formal advisors but informal advisors who I could check with, and would often do so and say, I've only got this information but I'm really keen to make this decision. And you know, one of those people, a close neighbour and I think a great intellect, was Philip Pettit, who's a professor of political philosophy, and who would sometimes say, well, what's the principle you're operating here? And let's go back to first principles. Okay, so now can you make the decision, can you not make the decision, looking at those principles? And Philip was, in particular, had me in that sort of frame of thinking, which I think served me extraordinarily well. Mm. Mm.
When you're consulting and getting information, of course, it's quite likely that you may get conflicting information from very credible sources.
You almost always get conflicting information.
U.S. President Harry Truman once famously wished for a one-handed economist.
Yes.
How do you handle that when you've got experts, but they're giving you conflicting information about what to do, or they're giving you conflicting predictions and things like that?
I suppose what you do is the same as what any academic does, is you make sure you're listening to all the information. Then you have to just draw it and make your best understanding. In fact, actually it was conflicting information over the issue of illicit drugs when I was very early in politics that made me decide to go back to university and study here at the ANU while I was in politics, because I thought I was having trouble managing perfectly rational arguments in favour of prohibition against perfectly rational arguments in favour of harm reduction, and I wasn't sure what I should be believing. In the end, even before I went to the university, I'd made a decision in favour of harm reduction, but it made me realise that I actually wanted to hone my analytical skills, so that when I later, after I'd been at university, and I look at these two pieces of information, I say, well, what was the size of the cohort in that study? How many other studies have reiterated the same thing, or is it a one-off that somebody's? How much is just cherry picking? And so to make a much more firmly academic way of looking at things before you make your decision, instead of just a gut reaction. I think the gut reaction decision making makes you actually quite vulnerable to the cherry pickers.
Great. Thanks very much. That was terrific.
Yeah, that's great.